Attention, attention. Arises the need to carry out a temporary evacuation of the residents of the city. We're kicking off this explainer directly in the chilling aftermath of April 26, 1986. Imagine hearing that exact eerie broadcast echoing through the completely oblivious, sleeping city of Pripyat. People were literally just told to pack for a temporary move, entirely unaware that they'd never ever return home.
Anatomy of a Disaster, the true story of Chernobyl. Okay, let's dive straight into this incredibly dark chapter of history. Today, we're going to demystify the complex mechanics and the deeply human sacrifices of the world's absolute worst nuclear disaster. Part 1. Anatomy of a Reactor. To even begin to understand how this tragedy happened, we first have to look at the actual science behind the Soviet RBMK reactor design. So, you might be wondering, what exactly goes wrong inside a core? Well, a really crucial factor here is something called xenon poisoning. When a reactor is running, it creates a byproduct called xenon-135. Think of xenon like a giant invisible sponge for neutrons. When the reactor's running at high power, no problem, the xenon just burns away. But when power drops, that xenon builds up fast. It absorbs so many neutrons that the reactor basically stalls out and falls into what's known as a xenon pit. And here's the crazy part. To climb out of that pit and maintain any reaction at all, operators are forced to pull out the control rods. They're essentially removing their only safety net. And that brilliantly illustrates a second incredibly fatal design flaw, the positive void coefficient. It sounds super complicated, but it's really just a deadly loop. You see, water cools the reactor, but it also absorbs neutrons. When the reactor heats up, that water boils into steam, creating these empty spaces, or voids. But steam doesn't absorb neutrons like liquid water does. So suddenly you have all these free-flying neutrons splitting more uranium, creating way more heat, which boils more water, creating more voids. It is a vicious, unstoppable cycle that drastically spikes the reactor's power. Part 2. The fateful safety test. Let's move over to the timeline to see exactly how this builds into the disastrous safety test intended to measure the spinning turbine's backup power. What's absolutely fascinating and terrifying about this timeline is watching the ticking clock. Literally every attempted fix just sealed their fate. It starts on April 25th at 2 p.m. when they actually disable the emergency core cooling system. Fast forward to 12:20 a.m., the power unexpectedly plummets. They're stuck in that xenon pit we just talked about, so they start pulling out almost all the control rods. At 1:23 a.m., despite the incredibly unstable conditions, the test officially kicks off. At 1:23 and 40 seconds, an operator hits the AZ5 scram button. The operators genuinely believed this safety switch was their ultimate lifeline, a kill switch to drop all the heavy control rods back in and stop the reaction. But here's the fatal flaw. The very bottom of those Soviet control rods had graphite tips. So as they slam into the core, that graphite displaces the cooling water. Suddenly, you have a massive lack of water replaced by graphite, which actually accelerates the reaction. The reactor was already highly unstable, so hitting that scram button was literally all gas and absolutely no brakes. Jumping up and down in their sockets, the control rods jammed. Inside, the core surged to over 100,000% of its design capacity. 100,000%! It was just way too much. The resulting massive steam explosion completely blew the 1,000-ton roof right off the building. Part 3. The human toll. Beyond the sterile physics, we have to examine the visceral, human horror that unfolded in the immediate aftermath of the explosion. When you think of radiation in movies, you probably imagine that steady click, click, click of a Geiger counter, right? Well, the true, terrifying sound of off-scale exposure is totally different. When those counters are overwhelmed by catastrophic radiation, like the 40 Ronins per hour coming off discarded firefighter boots, they don't click. They emit this continuous, bone-chilling, high-pitched squeal. That invisible squeal was literally the soundtrack of the immediate aftermath. And the people walking right into that squealing, invisible nightmare? The first responders. Firefighters arrived to fight the roof fires, and they had absolutely zero knowledge of the massive radiation leak. They wore absolutely no protective clothing. Guys like 25-year-old Vasily Ignatenko bravely fought the blazing, open-air graphite, totally unaware they were getting lethal, irreversible doses of radiation. 28 of these firefighters died of acute radiation sickness, and their bodies were so radioactive they literally had to be buried beneath heavy zinc and concrete. My love, they couldn't get a single pair of shoes to fit him. They buried him barefoot. This devastating recollection from Vasily's wife, Ludmila, abruptly slows our pacing down, doesn't it? It just brutally demands our attention to the physical, bodily reality of acute radiation sickness. Part 4. Evacuation and cleanup. With radioactive elements spewing into the sky, the response eventually had to shift from bureaucratic denial to a massive, desperate cleanup effort. Remember that broadcast we heard at the beginning? Despite the catastrophic danger, it took a full 36 hours before officials finally put 115,000 unaware residents on buses. They were permanently exiled from their model atomic city, completely upended, and told to pack only vital documents for what they thought was just a temporary move. 3,828. That is the exact number of human bio-robots sent onto the most deadly place on Earth. They called the roof of Reactor 4 Masha. See, they originally tried using remote-controlled lunar robotic rovers to clean up the mess, but the radiation was so intense, it fried the robots' electronics. They had absolutely no choice but to send in human beings. So what kind of gear did these reservists and soldiers have? Homemade shields made out of thick lead sheets. They literally wore protective plates, darkly dubbed egg baskets, over their crotches. Their entire job was to run out there and shovel highly radioactive graphite debris back into the smoking core. And because the radiation was so overwhelmingly intense, the absolute maximum allowable time a guy could spend on that roof was just 2 frantic minutes. Part 5. Fact versus fiction. Decades later, how we remember this trauma has definitely been warped by myths, which we really need to untangle from the verified historical records. A huge example of this is the so-called Bridge of Death. If you've seen the dramatizations, you've probably heard the myth that a massive crowd of doomed people gathered on a local bridge in the middle of the night to watch the glowing fires, and that they all subsequently died of radiation exposure. Well, the historical truth is that the sleeping city actually stayed indoors. The bridge already had its deadly reputation way before the disaster, simply because a steep arch caused terrible visibility and frequent fatal car crashes. So, considering this fatal mix of a subpar safety culture, corrupt systems, and absolutely unyielding reactor design flaws, we really have to ask, what is the true price of technological hubris? As we wrap up this explainer, you're left to wonder if the ultimate tragedy of Chernobyl was just a failure of the machine or a catastrophic failure of the human systems that built it. Thanks so much for exploring this with me today, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.